You hear the bells ringing, celebrating the birth of a prince. But just down the hall, Jane Seymour is bleeding to death, alone, and no one cares. She was the only wife of Henry VIII to give him a son, and yet she's the one history forgets the fastest. Henry, who divorced one wife and beheaded another, paused his hunting trips for only a few days after Jane died in childbirth. I've spent years researching royal postpartum deaths across Europe, and Jane stands out as the perfect symbol of how women were erased in service of empire. In this video, you'll uncover why Jane Seymour may have been the most dangerous wife, despite her reputation as the gentle one, and how her silent suffering reveals a truth still haunting women today. She fought to stay alive for 2 days after delivering a prince. While she bled, the court planned the naming ceremony. No one mourned her. No one even mentioned her. And if you think this is just another sad royal story, you're about to miss the chilling truth. Women have always been worshipped most. When they're no longer alive to speak, they echoed through the stone corridors of Hampton Court, jubilant, resounding, glorious, announcing the birth of a long-awaited prince. Outside, the city pulsed with celebration. Torches flickered, trumpets screamed, nobles embraced. It was October 1537, and the kingdom rejoiced. A son had finally been born to King Henry VIII. But inside the royal apartments, the light was dying. Jane Seymour, the queen consort, lay drenched in sweat and blood, her body racked with fever, her lips too dry to pray. But now, the same courtiers who toasted her fertility tiptoed past her door like mourners. The sweet scent of rosewater no longer masked the stench of rot. The future of England had arrived, and the woman who brought it into the world was slipping away, alone, forgotten in a palace built for glory, but soaked in the quiet horror of a dying queen. No one said it aloud, but Jane Seymour was being allowed to die, not murdered, not abandoned in some tower. No, this was subtler, more civilized. She had served her purpose. She had given the king what his other wives could not, and in the ruthless machinery of Tudor politics, that made her expendable. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. What's horrifying is how normal it seemed. You have to understand, Henry's court wasn't just dangerous, it was operatic. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been discarded like a broken relic. His second, Anne Boleyn, beheaded by a French swordsman brought in for the occasion. And now Jane, the quiet one, the good one, the obedient one, the one who was everything a Tudor queen was supposed to be, was dying in slow motion, while the man she married celebrated his son's christening with gold cups and embroidered sermons. And this, somehow, was the happy ending. People would say she died in peace, that she was gentle and serene, that she accepted her fate with grace. The bloody cloths, the screams that made the walls shake, the stifling silence outside her chambers, where servants held their breath and hoped no one would ask them to explain what was happening. And somewhere in the palace, Henry VIII was already thinking about his next marriage. You want to believe Jane's story is different, that she triumphed where others failed, that she gave birth to a king and was loved for it. But history is a mask, and beneath it, Jane's truth is far more chilling. Because what if her death wasn't a tragic accident, but the logical conclusion of a system that fed on women's bodies and silenced their screams with poetry? And what if the queen they painted as a saint was, in her final moments, just a terrified woman calling out for help that never came? The story doesn't end where the celebration begins. In fact, it's only just begun. It started long before Jane ever stepped into the spotlight. The shadow over her life was cast by the obsessions of a man who couldn't sleep at night without hearing the echo of his own dynasty dying. Henry VIII, king, reformer, tyrant, was not merely desperate for a son. He was haunted by the stillborn infants laid in velvet-lined coffins, by the soft cries of daughters he refused to claim, by the very idea that, after all the wars, all the splendor, all the burning and breaking and bleeding, the Tudor name might end with him. By 1536, the royal nursery was almost empty. Catherine of Aragon had aged out of usefulness in the king's eyes. The once powerful queen, married to Henry for more than 2 decades, had borne him a daughter, Mary, but no serving sons. Her reward, divorce, exile, death in solitude. Her heart said to be blackened when cut open after her passing, as if grief had physically infected her body. Then came Anne Boleyn, Henry's firebrand queen, brilliant, daring, and doomed. She had promised sons and birthed Elizabeth instead. Every miscarriage deepened Henry's paranoia. Every mood swing of hers stoked fears of witchcraft. When the court turned against her, it turned fast. Accusations of incest, adultery, treason, all of it orchestrated like theater. And Anne, the woman who had changed England's church and challenged its traditions, was executed in May 1536. Her head fell in one clean stroke, ironically, the most merciful act Henry ever granted her. So when Jane Seymour appeared at court, everything had already been razed to ash. She didn't arrive like a spark. She didn't need to. Jane knew better than to be dazzling. She stepped softly, not as a threat, but as a promise. Where Anne was provocative, Jane was pious. Where Catherine fought, Jane folded. And yet, behind the modest eyes and pale demeanor was something far sharper than anyone wanted to believe. Jane's family saw the opportunity first. The Seymours of Wiltshire were a calculating clan, less famous than the Boleyns, but no less ambitious. Edward Seymour, the elder brother, had been watching from the wings, learning the choreography of royal destruction. He understood that in a court of wolves, only the quietest prey survived. Thomas, the younger brother, played the flirt, the charmer, but he too understood the rules. Their sister would not dance. She would kneel, and the court would call it virtue. They placed Jane in Anne Boleyn's household. Think about that. Jane Seymour, future queen, served her predecessor in silence while the cracks in Anne's marriage widened. She was there in the corridors when Anne wept from another failed pregnancy. She was there when Henry stopped visiting Anne's chambers. She watched a woman fall from power step by step, word by word, rumor by rumor. And Jane remembered everything. She learned the choreography of survival. She learned that to be loved by Henry was dangerous, but to be useful to him was protection. She began shaping herself into an answer to his prayers. Not a woman, a solution. She refused his gifts, returned his letters, asked for nothing except virtue. That restraint, that chilling self-control made her irresistible to a king who had grown suspicious of women who wanted things. Jane made herself want nothing. And in that vacancy, Henry saw the mother of his son. By the time Anne Boleyn was dragged to the Tower, Jane Seymour was already wearing white, not in joy, in strategy. On May 19th, Anne died on the scaffold, executed by a swordsman brought from France, chosen for his precision. On May 30th, just 11 days later, Henry married Jane in a quiet ceremony. No parade, no music. It wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction, a risk, a second chance. The ink on Anne's death warrant had barely dried, and Jane's fingers were already slipping into the same cursed ring. The court whispered about how pale she looked, how tightly she held her hands. Some said she prayed throughout the ceremony. Others swore she stared ahead like she was walking into her own grave. And they weren't wrong, because in that very moment, somewhere inside Hampton Court, a cradle was already being prepared. But so was a coffin. They called it a quiet wedding, but nothing at court was ever truly quiet. Not when the ghosts of two former queens lingered in every embroidered tapestry and polished corridor. Not when the bride had been in the queen's household just weeks earlier, listening, learning, waiting. Jane Seymour didn't just walk into the role. She was placed there like a chess piece by hands that knew how to survive kings. The ceremony was brief, almost antiseptic. No processions, no feasts, only a few murmured blessings, as if speaking too loudly might rattle the bones of the woman Henry had just buried. But Jane, with her pale skin and solemn gaze, seemed carved from the very marble of Tudor funerary monuments. There was no triumph in her face. Only calculation, only silence. She understood something vital, something Anne and Catherine had not. Henry didn't want a wife. He wanted redemption, obedience, a woman who could disappear into the backdrop until summoned for duty. Jane became that mirage, a living reliquary of Tudor virtue, modesty lacquered over fear. In the weeks that followed, her life transformed into a ritual of performance. Each morning, she was dressed not for beauty but for symbolism. Gowns of somber color, long sleeves that concealed, headpieces that bowed like a curtain drawn. Every smile was measured, every word rehearsed. She became a walking sermon of humility. And yet, no gesture of hers was truly hers. She existed to embody an ideal, the anti-Anne, the antidote to scandal, the vessel of male legacy. Inside the court, Eyes watched her like hawks circling over prey. Some waited for her to misstep. Others prayed she'd succeed. For their own status, their own proximity to the throne depended on her womb. Even foreign ambassadors reported on her behavior, jotting down if she ate enough, if she spoke too much, if her hands trembled at court functions. And then there were the Seymours. Edward, now elevated and shrewd, played the court like a seasoned gambler. He coached Jane in discretion, in timing. He knew that queens didn't just fall from grace. They were pushed, with whispers and glances sharp enough to bleed. Thomas, reckless but charming, moved through the aristocracy like smoke, collecting favors, planting rumors. They weren't just protecting their sister. They were investing in her. But Jane was not passive in her own play. She learned fast, faster than anyone expected. She avoided the politics of religion, staying miles away from the theological battles that had burned through Anne. She offered no opinion on court reforms, never aligned herself too boldly with any faction, and she smiled only when required, never too widely, never too often. Still, beneath the layers of self-control, there were cracks. Private letters suggest moments of doubt, of loneliness so suffocating it nearly unspooled her. And there were nights when even the silence turned hostile, when she'd lie awake, hands resting on a stomach not yet swollen, wondering how much time she had, because everyone knew the countdown had begun. It wasn't just about being queen. It was about producing a prince. Not a daughter, not a miscarriage, a living, breathing male heir. Anything less would be failure, and failure meant danger. Henry, for all his warm smiles and gentle proclamations, was not a man known for patience. The same king who had once written passionate poems now calculated lineage like a banker counting coins. And Jane, delicate and composed, had become both the vault and the investment. There was no room for error. And then it happened. In early 1537, a whisper passed through the halls like wildfire. Jane was pregnant. The announcement was not grand. There was no royal decree or church bell ringing just yet. But inside the palace, everything shifted. Servants moved more carefully. Midwives arrived quietly. Prayers were whispered behind every door. Jane's body, once her own, now belonged to history, and she knew it. For the first time, the mask cracked, not in public, but in the private corners of her rooms, when the doors were shut and the ladies in waiting pretended not to notice the way her hands shook. Because beneath the lace and silk and sanctity, Jane Seymour was afraid. Afraid of failing. Afraid of succeeding. Afraid that her life, so carefully performed, so painfully constructed, might be lost the moment she fulfilled her purpose. She had climbed the mountain. Now she had to survive the peak. And somewhere, beyond the stone walls and golden crests, a nation held its breath. Because the queen was expecting, and so was fate. At first, the pregnancy was a miracle whispered in candlelight. Jane walked differently. Her waistline thickened. The kitchens were told to prepare broth instead of meat, fruits instead of wine. Henry ordered tapestries embroidered with scenes of inheritance and strength. Fathers and sons, lions and thrones. The palace buzzed with superstitions dressed as ceremony. And Jane, she became a relic in motion, more sacred than sovereign, more fragile than queen. Her chambers were transformed into a gilded cage, every corner watched by eyes trained to record signs from heaven or omens from hell. She was no longer a woman. She was prophecy. Her days blurred into processions of silence and ritual. Priests murmured daily blessings. Midwives adjusted pillows, measured her breath. Male doctors stood just out of reach, ready to pounce should anything falter. She was expected to eat, but not too much. To pray but not tire herself, to glow but not sweat. Every sigh, every tremor was analyzed and reported back to the king, who studied her health like a general watching the skies before a battle. And Henry was transformed, not into a tender husband but into a man possessed by the fever of legacy. He ordered baby garments months before birth. He commissioned a new royal cradle lined with ermine and gold. He asked for astrologers to chart the stars and midwives to swear oaths on relics. If Jane was the vessel, he was the architect of hope. But even in his obsession, he never sat long at her side. He spoke of her like a miracle he had purchased. Delicate, divine, and utterly dependent on proper care. Except Care meant surveillance, and support meant pressure. Jane was surrounded by women who smiled with their teeth clenched, who bowed while betting on whether she would die in childbirth like so many before her. Her food was tested daily, her linens changed 3 times a day. But comfort? Affection? A hand held in the dark? Those never came. Even the air around her felt curated. Windows were closed to block out sickness. No one with a limp or scar was allowed to approach. The old women whispered, it was bad luck for a pregnant queen to see deformity. So, instead, Jane spent her days staring into emptiness, praying to a god who had not saved the others, breathing in the perfume of dying roses sent from foreign courts. Letters poured in from ambassadors and nobles, congratulating her as though the child had already been born, as though she had already succeeded, as though her body had been claimed by the crown and no longer mattered. Then came the nights, long, unbearable stretches where the walls seemed to pulse with her fear. She dreamed of Anne, standing headless at the end of the bed, of Catherine weeping into cold stone. She would wake slick with sweat, the sheets tangled, her mouth filled with the coppery taste of dread. The nurses said it was common. All royal mothers felt such anxiety, but Jane knew better. She wasn't just afraid of childbirth. She was afraid of surviving it, because if she failed to produce a healthy son, she might be sent away like Catherine. If she succeeded but complained, she might be discarded like Anne. And if she died, well, then they'd build her a beautiful tomb and speak her name like a prayer. The stakes were not merely life and death. They were silence or legend, anonymity or sainthood. And the pressure only mounted. The further along she grew, the less control she had. Her movements were scheduled, her meals pre-chosen, her visitors vetted. The entire kingdom held its breath every time she sneezed. Foreign diplomats sent coded messages reporting her skin tone, the slope of her belly, the look in Henry's eyes when he glanced her way. They knew if this child was a boy, it would cement England's future and redefine Europe's alliances. If not, the realm could plunge into chaos. And Jane? She was a symbol wrapped in skin. Then came one night in late September, when the wind changed direction and the stars grew sharp. Jane sat alone in her chambers, staring into a silver mirror, watching her own face warp under candlelight. That was the night she realized she was not afraid anymore. Not because she had found courage, but because it was too late. She would give birth soon. That was inevitable. And what came next would not be up to her. But what she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that the kingdom was already making plans. Not just for a birth, but for a funeral. But somewhere in the shadow of all that joy, death had already begun to circle. It began at dusk on October 9th. The wind had shifted again, sharp now, autumn cutting through the velvet drapes like a knife. Jane was led to her birthing chamber at Hampton Court, surrounded by attendants with lips pressed shut and eyes heavy with prayer. Like something was already unraveling, her labor had started, and it would not end quickly. What followed was not a birth, it was a siege. Jane screamed, not once, not in waves, but constantly. The sound wasn't human. It was too ragged, too deep. The palace heard it, through the walls, down the halls, even into the courtyards where guards pretended not to flinch. She labored for 3 days, 3 days of agony that felt biblical. Her body twisted against itself, her skin turned to parchment, her voice a hoarse ghost of its former self. No one dared speak of failure, but no one spoke of success either. The doctors, educated men in robes and rings, stood by helplessly, murmuring Latin and consulting charts as if ancient planets could push a child through bone. The midwives worked their hands raw, whispering into Jane's ear, trying herbs, cloths, heat, cold, every medieval trick drawn from 1,000 half-remembered rituals. At one point, a priest was called, then dismissed. Then called again. And outside the chamber, Henry paced, not near, not beside her, not holding her hand. No. He stayed in another wing entirely, reviewing plans for the christening, consulting with his council, discussing diplomatic letters. He asked for updates. He did not ask to see her. He waited, with the same stoic detachment one might hold while waiting for the outcome of a chess match. Because that's all it was to him. The end game of a political strategy. And then, finally, on the 12th of October, a cry. Not Jane's! A new sound! Soft, high, unmistakable. A boy, a prince, Edward. The palace exploded. Bells rang from towers. Fireworks were prepared. Servants danced. The kingdom exhaled. A Tudor heir had arrived. Henry wept, or so the reports say. He declared it a divine victory, and he named his son after a saint. But amid the joy, no one seemed to notice that Jane was no longer speaking. Her breath came shallow. Her skin glistened with fever. Blood continued to soak the sheets beneath her, more than any woman should lose. Far more. They said she was recovering. She sat up. She held the child. She smiled for portraits. But recovery is a cruel illusion when the rot begins from within. What she had was not weariness. It was infection. Sepsis. A silent predator, born of dirty instruments and broken flesh, creeping through her veins with each passing hour. By the 5th day, she burned. Her temperature climbed. Her mind unraveled. She muttered prayers, then nonsense, then nothing. They bled her, believing it would release the sickness. They gave her powdered pearls, holy water, honey-soaked herbs. And still her body convulsed like it was trying to expel the soul itself. And Henry? Henry was busy organizing the prince's baptism. The queen was dying, and her husband was choosing velvet capes. There is no tenderness in the records, no bedside vigil, no whispered vows. There is only a brief note that Jane was unwell, and another that Henry ordered musicians for the christening. Because, to him, Jane had completed her purpose. She had delivered the heir. She could fade now quietly, like a character written out of a play. And yet, on her last night, Jane spoke. Only once, through cracked lips, her voice almost gone. She asked that Edward be raised with kindness, that Henry forgive her if she had displeased him. And then she slipped into silence, drifting between worlds until, at dawn on October 24th, her body surrendered. There was no crowd, no procession, only the cold breath of morning and the quiet rustle of servants removing the bloodied linens. Her name was recorded, her death registered, her chambers emptied, and that was all. Except it wasn't, because even as her corpse cooled, the stories began. The myth of Jane Seymour, the perfect queen, the gentle lamb, the martyr mother, and no one, not the court, not Henry, not the historians who would later paint her cheeks pink and eyes saintly, no one ever mentioned the screams, but they didn't fade. Not really. They stayed in the stone. In the tapestries, in the silence that followed every Tudor christening thereafter. And if you listen closely, late at night, they say you can still hear her, just for a moment, calling out in a voice that wasn't praying for sainthood. It was begging for help. The bells that had rung to celebrate her son's birth tolled again, this time slow, mournful, deliberate. Jane Seymour was dead, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as if the world might pause, but it didn't. Henry VIII did not retreat into grief. He didn't mourn beside her lifeless body. He didn't fall to his knees or tear at his robes. No, just hours after the Queen's final breath, he was discussing foreign alliances. Just hours after she was lowered into the cold earth, he was reviewing portraits of potential brides. He would later call her his one true wife. He would later say she was the only one he truly loved. But in the days following her death, Henry was occupied with silk, scrolls, treaties, christening pageantry, and matters of state. Jane's chamber was scrubbed clean, her letters burned, her attendants dismissed with stipends and silence. There were no public tears, no royal decrees of mourning beyond what protocol demanded, just a gentle erasure, like wiping chalk from slate. And that should have been the end, but it wasn't. Because then came the story. The story they needed to tell. The one that polished her into a saint. The dead woman who couldn't speak for herself became the model queen. Pious, silent, obedient, sacrificial. Paintings emerged, her face serene, hands folded, lips forever closed. No one painted her screaming. No one painted her dying. Henry needed her to be perfect. The court needed her to be holy. The people needed her to be a symbol. She became the queen who had done what no other could, given England a prince, and vanished with grace. In a kingdom soaked in blood and betrayal, her image was clean, but it was a lie. Behind the portrait hung whispers. The women who attended her spoke only behind closed doors, if they dared speak at all. The foreign ambassadors, once so eager to record her smiles, began to ask questions. Why had she not received more care? Why had the infection been allowed to fester? Why had Henry waited so long before summoning physicians with real skill? And somewhere beneath the polished oak floors of Windsor, behind the hymns and the incense, that question hung in the air like rot. Was Jane allowed to die? Because her death had solved so many problems. A queen who had done her duty didn't have to outlive her usefulness. A dead wife didn't question her legacy. A dead mother didn't interfere with the king's plans. And best of all, a dead woman can't contradict the story you want the world to hear. Jane was no longer Jane. She was myth, and the myth worked. The Protestants called her a martyr for the English Reformation. The Catholics begrudgingly praised her virtue. Henry used her memory as leverage in every future marriage, invoking her name like a relic too sacred to match. He buried her in the place of honor, next to him, where no other wife would lie. Not Anne, not Catherine, not any of the women who had dared to live. But here's the part they never carved into the stone. Jane didn't choose this. She didn't volunteer her body for sacrifice. She didn't bow to death with a smile. She begged for comfort. She hoped to live. She tried to survive in a palace that only cared about her as long as she was fertile, silent, and useful. And when she stopped being those things, when she became just another woman in pain, she was left to slip quietly from memory and into myth. So the real twist isn't that Jane died. The real twist is that everyone else lived with it and called it peace. But peace doesn't bleed, and legends don't scream. History doesn't mourn Jane Seymour. It praises her. Quietly, reverently, as if silence itself were proof of grace. She is remembered as the one who got it right. The obedient wife, the holy mother, the queen who didn't fight back, who didn't speak out, who gave England its long-awaited heir, and then conveniently died before she could become complicated. She is remembered because she disappeared. And yet, what if we remembered her differently? What if we remembered that her life was not a parable of duty, but a study in survival? That her silence wasn't serenity, but strategy? That her virtue was the only weapon left to a woman born into a court that turned wombs into wagers? Jane lived in a world that did not expect her to matter, not as a person, only as a possibility. And when that possibility was fulfilled, when Edward was born and her usefulness expired, her body became collateral. Her death was not mourned. It was processed, documented, tucked neatly into the royal narrative. And from that moment forward, every detail of her real experience was quietly smothered under velvet and prayer. But death didn't end her story. It echoed in the boy she left behind. Edward VI, frail and sickly, burdened by a crown too heavy for a child and a legacy soaked in maternal blood. He would rule for 6 short years, never knowing a mother's voice, never seeing the face that died for his life. Some said he was brilliant, others called him cold. But what's certain is this: his reign ended in crisis. No heir, no dynasty, no lasting peace. All that suffering, all that sacrifice, for what? For a future that collapsed before it could take root. And in the hollow left by Jane's absence, others fought to fill the space. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, used her name as currency. One became Lord Protector. The other chased the king's widow. Both ended badly, executed, forgotten. Just more ghosts trailing behind the woman who had vanished too soon. Even her death, once called divine, was weaponized. Protestants used it to crown her a martyr. Catholics held it up as a warning. Political factions bent her memory into shapes she never asked for. Jane became a battlefield in a war she didn't survive. Her name became a hymn sung by people who never knew the sound of her fear. And still, no justice, no apology, no reckoning. It would take centuries for anyone to ask the right questions. Why was she left untreated for so long? Why did no one intervene sooner? Why was her story repackaged instead of examined? These aren't just questions about one queen. They're questions about every woman written out of history because she didn't scream loud enough, or because screaming never helped, because Jane Seymour wasn't a holy ideal. She was a human cost, a woman reduced to her reproductive value, a mother who bled out in a gilded room while the kingdom toasted her success. And the tragedy isn't that she died. It's that no one ever called it murder, not with a knife, but with a shrug. So maybe the lesson isn't about royalty at all. Maybe it's about how systems endure, not through violence alone, but through silence. Through stories crafted to comfort those in power. Through myths that glorify pain if it serves a crown. And maybe, just maybe, if we finally remember Jane Seymour, not as the perfect queen, but as the perfect example of what perfection costs, then her story might finally become something more than a soft tragedy. It might become a warning, because the truth is, behind every great man history chooses to remember, there's often a woman it chooses to forget. And tonight, you've remembered her, not as a myth, but as a woman. And once you see her clearly, you can't unsee the others. Sometimes, history whispers louder than it shouts. And if we listen closely, not just to the dates and names and monuments, but to the silences, the pauses, the untold, we start to hear something deeper, something human. Behind the crowns and battles and legacies, there are quiet truths, fragile and aching. They remind us that power isn't just built on triumph. It's built on loss, on sacrifice, on lives erased to make space for empires. There's a strange comfort in remembering that, because when we see history not as a collection of heroes, but as a web of choices and consequences, we also start to see ourselves more clearly. We see the systems that shape us, the stories we're asked to accept, and the cost of pretending some voices matter more than others. We see how easily a life can be rewritten into a symbol, and how dangerous that erasure can be. And maybe that's the most human truth of all. That every life, no matter how small or forgotten, holds weight. That silence doesn't mean peace. That being good, or quiet, or useful isn't always enough to be safe. That sometimes even love is not protection, and duty is not reward. But even in the face of all that, there's still something unbreakable about remembering, about bearing witness, about saying, I see you, I hear you, you mattered. Your pain was real. Your story is worth telling, not for what it meant to kings or kingdoms, but for what it meant to you. So if tonight your heart feels heavy, let it be. Let it rest in the knowledge that empathy itself is resistance. That by refusing to forget, we keep the human at the center of the historical. That in choosing to care, even centuries later, we reclaim something sacred, compassion. Because history, when stripped of myth, becomes a mirror. And in that reflection, we find the strength to imagine something better, not just for the past, but for what comes next. Thank you for joining me in this space. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel, leave a comment. I'd love to hear where and when you're listening. And if you'd like more stories told slowly, thoughtfully, with heart and honesty, please subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another thread to follow, another voice to uncover, another truth waiting in the dark. Until then, take care. And remember, what we choose to remember, we choose to value.